Let's take a little time to reveal the prehistoric stories that the earth once concealed. Mix them all together on this ancient land. It's time to spread some Palaeo Jam. Hello, dear listener. Welcome to Season 3 of Palaeo Jam, and this is the first episode of Season 3. I'm your host, Michael Mills, and I'm at Flinders University in the Palaeo Library, which is where we've recorded quite a few of our episodes. But this is the first time we are speaking with Dr Isaac Kerr. G'day, Isaac.
Hello, Michael.
And so just recently, a paper, well, when I refer to it as a paper, it's more like War and Peace. It's more like this massive 261 pages of stuff, remarkable stuff. And I'm going to talk about that to begin with, but it's all about prehistoric kangaroos. So 261 pages, like, it's a lot, isn't it?
It is, yeah. It was even bigger as a thesis.
So the work about Protemnodon was your thesis, and you kind of distilled it down into this 261 pages.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it was this one paper was at least 2 chapters of my thesis. I also had a chapter on Protemnodon nombi, which became nombi, which some listeners may have heard of. That's a fossil kangaroo from New Guinea that I ended up doing a bit of work on after I kicked it out of the genus Protemnodon. But yeah, so this is the vast bulk of the thesis, which is why it took 6 years to get it from a lit review through to an actual paper.
Yeah, so let's go through the process to start with, and then we'll come to the outcomes of the process. So you talk about you went to 14 museums in 4 countries to gather data, and what sort of period of time did that take?
That took at least 2 years just to get all of the data, just to see all of the fossils that I was working on. Took 2 years, rounded up very much, or rounded down rather. Yeah, and even then it was like, so I was sort of brought in. My goal was just to work out what species there were in Protemnodon, so make sure that the genus kind of makes sense taxonomically, and how many species there were and how to tell them apart. That was the extent of my project. Anything else was a bonus, And then just as sort of my time went on and I was doing more research, in the first kind of few months of my PhD, there was just more and more and more material, more and more spread out. Yeah, and Gavin Prideaux, my supervisor, was saying, "Oh, and you'll have to go to, Berkeley in California. Oh, you have to go to London." It's just like, oh, crikey. And so, yeah, the first, even really 2.5 years, just like writing the literature review, but also writing grant application after grant application.
To be able to fund the things,
just to be able to
do the stuff.
To even go to the museums where these fossils, have been for 50 years or 150 years. So that took a long time.
Yeah, and I guess it's that thing, you start with this kernel of an idea, and then you don't realise when you've started it, it's like, and then there's this, and then there's this, and then there's this. One of the things too is it talks about 800 specimens. Now, is that 800 individual fossils, or is that 800 individual animals?
So some of them are just bones, but a lot of those 800 are multiple elements. So I think in the end there were over 2,500 elements that I measured in total. But then, like, one of the skeletons, the sort of main, photo coming from the paper, the main image is pretty much a complete skeleton of Protemnodon viator, which was one of the species that we named. And that's like, if I counted all the bones in that, we're getting nowhere. Yeah. So it was a lot to get my head around.
So part of the outcome in this whole process was that, I guess, working out what is a Protemnodon and what is not, what actually comprises the genus and species within that. So in the shortest way, well, no, don't say that, because it could spend the rest of the podcast episode. What makes a critter, what makes an organism a Protemnodon? What makes it? Because you said at the beginning, oh, we had to kick this one out. Is that one of Owen's? Like you've poor Richard Owen, been dead for over 100 years. He used teeth, to go, oh, this is this and this, and teeth are, paleontologists love teeth. But you've come along and you've gone, well, actually, no.
Yeah, well, the trouble with kangaroo teeth is they're all the bloody same, for starters.
Yeah.
To just a hilarious level. Tim Flannery's got a paper called A Phylogeny of the Macropodidae, a Study in Convergence. So that's a paleontologist saying, woe is me, these teeth all look the same.
Yeah, so like even in contemporary, let's like kangaroos that are alive now. So if you look at a yellow-footed rock wallaby and you look at a grey kangaroo and you look at others, the teeth are much more similar than we would expect for comparative other species. Because we know that a yellowfoot is clearly a different species to a red kangaroo.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's not to say that you can't tell them apart. You can, but when you start to try and define a genus, which Protemnodon is, based on just their teeth, it gets really, really hard, because kangaroos have had the same idea as separate groups a lot of times, and so people try to use their premolar, which is the sort of the long cutting tooth at the front of their cheek teeth, which is what the genus is named after. Protemnodon means front cutting tooth in Greek. They tried to base it all on that, but there's just too many kangaroos with really similar
same kind of
premolars.
thing.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, that brings us back to the question I said. So what are the defining things that in your 261 pages or your 10,000 pages of your PhD, where you're able to say, this is a Protemnodon, this is not, this one we need to look at closer. What causes you to kick it out or kick it in?
Well, so they do have a morphology that defines their teeth. So I can say, okay, you've got to have this sort of dental structure to be a Protemnodon. I won't go into too much detail, but basically what made Protemnodon nombi not a member of Protemnodon in the end was that it didn't have that. And what was particularly interesting about Protemnodon nombi is not only did it not fit with Protemnodon, it ended up not fitting with any genus of kangaroo. So what I'm saying really is that despite so many kangaroos, looking the same in terms of their teeth, Protemnodon nombi, which became nombi, was actually really quite odd. So that was fun. So it just didn't fit in with the sort of the structure of Protemnodon teeth. And what I ended up basing Protemnodon on as a genus was not the teeth at all, but the pelvis and the phalanges of the fourth toe.
That's quite specific, isn't it? That's.
I think it's got to be the first case of a kangaroo genus hinging on those two areas.
Okay, and but in looking at that, were you able to go to and I guess the answer is yes. You were able to clearly identify.
Yeah,
that there were those that have those features, and those that don't, and that's enough.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. It's that really is the only part of the skeleton where you can pick it up and not just not have any doubt in your mind. You go, that is Protemnodon.
And it's sufficiently different from other kangaroos.
Yeah, that's right.
To go, this is not like any of those.
What sort of clouds the issue has a lot to do with allometry. So, as kangaroos get bigger, greater body masses, they start to converge on each other again, and you get really, really big grey kangaroos in the Pleistocene. People might have heard of Macropus ferragus, Macropus titan, that whole mess. Those are like
that whole mess.
Oh, it's a mess. Yeah, that's one of the few that's worse than Protemnodon was. But yeah, so those were very big kangaroos, 160 kilo grey kangaroos kind of thing. And once they start getting that big, a lot of their skeleton starts to look like Protemnodon. But it's just because they're dealing with the same sort of body mass as Protemnodon were dealing with, while being fairly closely related kangaroos. Yeah, and so it came down to the pelvis and the parts of the foot.
Okay, so in the paper you talk about that you've concluded by kicking some out by these three new, and we'll talk about the three new in a minute. So there are clearly 7.
Yeah, 7
within the genus, but adapted to different environments and even the ways that they hopped. So how do you work out for the non-paleontologist? How do you look at a set of bones and go, oh, this is how it hopped or didn't hop? These are the adaptations that we can put, for want of a better description, flesh on the bone to describe what it did while it was alive. Because that's what people want to know, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, so this is far from detailed functional morphological analysis that leaves no shred of doubt in the mind. This was very much, as I said, my main aim was to work out just what species there even were and how to tell them apart. But in doing that, we compared each Protemnodon species to the other, and I also compared them to what we might call modern functional analogues. So living kangaroos, we know, how they move, what environments they're adapted to, things like that. And we can compare the skeletons of these extinct Protemnodon to these living kangaroos and go, okay, well, they're very similar in terms of their, hind limb proportions is a big one, in terms of the structures of their foot. So they were probably moving, similarly in this kind of capacity and adapted to this sort of environment. So what it came down to for the sort of larger Pleistocene species was one of the kangaroos, Protemnodon viator, which is, I've found it to be a sort of more arid-adapted species. It had a very short femur and a very long tibia, so very short thigh bone and a long shin bone. And very basically put, that's something that we see in red and grey kangaroos. And you get a shorter femur and a longer tibia as you become what we might describe as higher geared as a kangaroo. So the kangaroos that are really efficient and hop really fast have a shorter femur and a longer tibia, and that's what we saw in this one Protemnodon.
So they're the higher geared ones.
Yeah, yep. And so you go, okay, well that's like a tick, that suggests that it's high geared. Like what else in the skeleton might tell us that, or be evidence against that? And so, then you look at their foot and you get the calcaneus, the heel bone of Protemnodon viator it had a very long calcaneal tuber, and it's narrow and very tall. And so that's, first of all, a powerful lever for the calcaneal tendon to attach to and to flex the foot, which is the sort of, moving from like a flat foot to like like a ballerina on point kind of thing.
So it's going to help it bounce.
Yeah, it helps it hop. Yeah, so that's the big hop, the big muscle that flicks the foot and tosses the body forward, as it were. And in kangaroos that are doing that motion constantly, with great force and moving in a straight line without changing direction much, like your red and grey kangaroos, you need, first of all, that powerful lever, so a long tuberosity, and you need it to be well supported in what we call the sagittal plane, which is sort of up and forward and back. And so in Protemnodon viator, we saw that ability, basically, that structure there to support, powerful, sustained hopping.
Okay, so that's viator. That's one of the new 3.
Yeah.
Tell us about one of the others.
Yeah, okay. So Protemnodon mamkura was a fun one as well. So mamkura was interesting because it has teeth that we can't tell apart from Protemnodon viator. But instead of being arid adapted and arid distributed, generally it's distributed across the south coast of Australia. So it's all the way from southwest and west Australia all the way down into Tassie. So got it from mountains in Tassie. And it was... Because I was
going to say, because in the paper, when you look at the distribution of Protemnodons, they're kind of everywhere, including New Guinea.
That's right, yeah.
And we might come back to that. But anyway, back to mamkura.
Yeah, so mamkura had, very similar teeth we couldn't tell apart. But despite that, had a very different skeleton. And, for example, it had a much longer femur and a shorter very robust rather than sort of long and thin. We say gracile or gracile tibia. It had a robust shin bone. And that aligned it more with sort of slower moving, we would say lower geared, less efficient hopping kangaroos.
So is it more like a Euro?
Yeah, it has similarities to a Euro.
Macropodus robustus, funny, because that's because they're if you go up to the Flinders Ranges, you see, and they're interesting because they're chunky.
Yeah, that's sort of how I describe Protemnodon to people to try and picture. It's like if you've ever seen a Euro, or they get called wallaroos as well. Think of how they're sort of just that much more kind of chunky and thicker than a red or a grey kangaroo. Protemnodon were probably a bit more so again. And particularly Mamkura was probably not such a strong hopper as a Euro is. They're still pretty well arid adapted and pretty quick movers. Mamkura was probably mostly moving with its forelimbs as well, so mostly doing a quadrupedal bound, you might say.
Okay, so that slow walk that we see kangaroos doing, but faster.
Yeah, and possibly not involving their tail. So you might see that your red and grey kangaroos use their tail as they're moving slowly, like when they're grazing. That's called pentapedal motion. Or
and you
hunting.
see when you see the prints on the ground, you see that tail where it sometimes scrapes on the ground.
Which is such a weird, cool thing. Just a great example of how odd kangaroos are. Like, who's doing that?
But this is just weird again. I suppose, but it's not weird. It's weird because when we see things that we haven't seen before. It's like, well, that's weird. Well, no, it wasn't at the time.
Yeah, totally. So we're just left with this kind of, just this particular type of kangaroo, and we've got a narrow idea of a kangaroo. But actually, they're so much broader. I mean, you start to get into the short face, the Stenurian kangaroos, and you're getting real.
That walked around.
Yeah, why not?
That just does my head in too. But again, because it's not familiar to us.
Yeah.
If there were giant short-faced kangaroos, like a kangaroo with the head of a koala, like walking around, kind of T-Rex style, with its head to the front and its tail to the back, like if they were around now, there would be nothing weird about it. Well, when Europeans arrived, they would have thought that was all weird because they thought everything was weird. But we wouldn't, as Australians, see that weird because it's part of our existing thing. But because it's not part of what it's our thing, isn't it? What we think of as kangaroos.
Our narrow temporal experience of Australian fauna.
Yeah. That's we should write that down. A narrow temporal experience of Australian fauna. But it defines how we defines how we interpret and look at some of these other things. Okay, so anything else about Mamkura?
So the way I sort of picture it moving is if you've seen like a paddy melon or a quokka, is that they spend a lot of their time moving sort of low to mid speed using their forelimbs as well, using what we call a quadrupedal bound. But if you spook them and they've got to move quick, they hop. And they might, put their hands down, just for a little bit, just for a couple of hops, and then go back to hopping. That's the sort of movement that I would hypothesize for Mamkura. That's based on its morphology, on its limb proportions. It's got a very robust forelimb, which you really would have to see for a kangaroo of that mass, talking like 130, 140 kilos. To have any use for its forelimbs at all, at any kind of speed, it would have to have a robust.
It would need so it's not going to have those forelimbs and not use them functionally. Yeah. So are they like a giant quokka then? 150 kilo quokka.
Yeah, complete with the smile.
And did they smile happily like quokkas? Of course.
Yeah, I'm a little hesitant, obviously, to say giant quokka because I feel like then that's what they become.
That's what they become in people's minds.
And people
we've just done that, and anyone now listening to this podcast is going to be picturing giant quokkas hopping.
Mark it.
I'm so sorry for destroying your work.
No, it's mostly because it's at this point, it's a vague understanding of what the species is, and I'm hoping that with the sort of better taxonomic understanding of the sort of entire skeleton that this research has provided, that people will now pick this up where I've finished up this project and investigate with a lot more specificity, like how the different species moved and lived.
Because one of the cool things, of course, is that with this particular project is that this paper is open access.
Mm.
You know, one of the great things that we've seen in the last few years with science and paleontology in particular is open access to papers so that people, everyday people, can have a look at it and read it. And one of the arguments against that sort of access in the past was like, but you know, people, what if they read it and misunderstand it? And I was like, well, they're being fed misinformation, so you might as well give them access to actual information and science and stuff. So I think, you know, commend you and the team for allowing it and putting it in that space, because it does facilitate those discussions and people to be able to look at it, even if it's challenging and stuff. So the third, what's the third?
The third new one is Protemnodon AKA. I should say Mamkura was named by the Bungandij people.
Cool, and there was a process, wasn't there? Because
people,
you can't just go, I'm just going to pick an Aboriginal word and
exactly.
So how did what's the story behind the name and being given permission, because you'd be given special permission to use the word?
Yeah, that's right. So as I said, the species is spread out along the south coast, but the best fossils we have are from Green Waterhole Cave, which is in southeast and South Australia, it's near Mount Gambier. And the Aboriginal people from there are called the Boandik people.
Yep.
Yeah, and they speak Bungandij language, which is across southeast and South Australia and into Western Vic, I think. And I set about trying to contact them, and they've got a corporation called the Burundi's Corporation. And they basically waived any fee they might normally have put there, which was very generous of them, and had their language experts and elders work on a name for the species based on sort of, my characterization, I guess, of what the species was like.
You described kind of what this particular Protemnodon did and how it moved and what it might have looked like and stuff, and they've come back. So what does Mamkura itself mean?
It means great kangaroo, but great in both sort of, grand would be good.
Grand, is
grand,
it? Yeah, okay.
Great in a sort of a powerful and maybe even wise sense is my understanding. And so they sent that back and we're like, please send us the paper when it comes out, which I have done, and I'm really hoping to meet them in person at some point as well.
It is great. It's a great way of introducing First Nation languages to people.
Yeah,
and it's also a reminder too that there's often a conversation about what caused the extinction of the megafauna, and if we've got time, we might touch on that. But it's patchy. It's patchy, and we know that megafauna were around up until 40.
Yeah, well, in Australia, the most recent Protemnodon is from Tassie. Mamkura we have from 40,500 years ago.
So 40,500 years ago. We know Aboriginal Australians were here 50 to 60,000 years or more. So there's a big chunk of time. But where extinctions took place and what the cause of them is quite patchy. So I think it's cool for names like Mamkura to be part of the sharing of the story of that. Okay, Dawsonay.
Yeah, so Dawsonay was named for Dr. Lynn Dawson, who was a paleontologist at, I think, UNSW, and she did a lot of work at Big Sink, which is part of the Wellington Caves complex, but specifically a Pliocene deposit. So Dawsonay is older than Protemnodon viator and Mamkura, and possibly their ancestor was what our phylogeny suggested. So the closest relative of those two species.
So when you're working out whether something's an ancestor or an uncle or an aunt, so it's kind of what is it that you look at? Obviously, it's older and it looks a bit similar. How do you come to that conclusion?
So I basically made a character matrix. So I I I took a lot of characters from previously existing phylogenies. So somebody's already worked out a lot of the characteristics that help us best understand kangaroo evolution. And so I took some of those and sort of rephrased them to describe the variation in Protemnodon a bit better. And then I observed sort of what varied between the species groups that we were seeing. And we scored them. So that's to say that we gave, if this bone has this characteristic, you give it a 0. If it doesn't have that, you give it a 1. If it has that characteristic, but like this, you give it a 2. And then basically you put it into this program that looks at the most likely, arrangement in terms of their evolution. So you say, okay, this one's most similar. It's got the fewest changes in its characteristics if we put it, more closely related to this species. And so what it comes down to in purely fossil analyses is, just how they look. So we don't have any genetic material to tell Protemnodon apart, which would definitely make for more robust phylogenetic hypotheses. But so what we did there was score the entire species groups. But Mamkura and Viator, very surprisingly, came out as very closely related, with Dorsinae as their closest relative. And the reason I say ancestor, which is a little bit dodgy, is just because it's older and closely related to the two of those species.
Yeah, and so it's not unreasonable to suggest that it's an ancestor. Okay, we've just got a few minutes to go. So coming back to Dorsinae, because we've talked a bit about the other two new ones in terms of what it would have been like if you saw them and what they would do and how they would move. What can you tell us about Dorsinae?
So can't tell you heaps about Dorsinae because it's known from much less material, but it does seem to be somewhere between Viator and Mamkura in terms of its hopping ability. So we might call it mid-geared or medium-geared. So maybe something like a swamp wallaby.
Okay, which kind of makes sense too, doesn't it? If it is the ancestor, that its descendants kind of, one went off and did one thing and the other went off and did the other.
Yeah, I mean, it's just what you'd be looking for if you were wanting to support, your sort of slightly confusing phylogenetic, hypothesis about the two Pleistocene ones, the weirdos that are somehow closely related.
Yeah.
Something to link the two.
Yeah. All right, so with a couple of minutes that we've got left, so you what was it about? I want to come back to Owen because I love the idea that you've actually said, "I'm sorry, Richard Owen, I'm kicking your definition out," because he's quite a significant character in the history of science. I mean, what's it like when you're actually challenging the work of somebody like him?
It's daunting.
Is Darwin next? Is he next on your hit list?
Yeah, let's take him down. Yeah, no, I don't know. You don't really want to be seen as an iconoclast, especially not a deliberate one, going for cherished figures. But thankfully for me, Owen is far from a cherished figure these days. He mostly gets described as an odious man, which is such a good phrase. But so his definition of Protemnodon had actually mostly gone out the window already. Alan Bartholomew did a revision in 1973, which was also mostly based on teeth and a lot to do with size. And so I was then working mostly off Bartholomew's definition and sort of adapting that and expanding on that. On Richard Owen, I feel this is a funny place to end. Jacob Van Zolen, my office mate, and I actually have an Owen jar akin to a swear jar in the office because both of our groups that we work on were first described by Richard Owen. And whenever he's done something that's just really mucked up, something, you're like, oh, I've got to spend 3 days on this now thanks to Owen. You say, I'll bleep it out, flippin' Owen. And then you catch yourself and you're like, oh, and we got to put money in the Owen jar.
So how much money's in the Owen jar? Is this what is now going to pay the next phase of the research?
I think we've probably got about $80.
Oh well, that's working towards a good end of year celebration.
Yeah, well, it was either that or we want to get a painting made of him.
And on that note, it is an appropriate note to end the Owen swear jar. Thank you so much, Dr. Isaac Kerr.
Thank you, Millsy. Nice to be here.
It's time to spread some Palaeo Jam.